A maid breaks down in the silence of the kitchen at midnight, unaware that someone is about to see her pain. The kitchen had always been the quietest place in the house, a world hidden in shadows after everyone had gone to sleep, a place where the echoes of laughter and clinking glasses from the dining room never reached. At midnight, it belonged only to me, the hum of the refrigerator, my only companion, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, marking time that felt endless. I stood by the sink, sleeves rolled up, hands submerged in water gone cold hours ago, scrubbing dishes that seemed to multiply no matter how many I cleaned. The silver clattered against porcelain in a rhythm so hollow it almost mocked me, and before I realized it, tears had begun to blur the reflection of the kitchen lights on the water's surface. I told myself to stop, to hold them back the way I always did. But tonight, I couldn't. Tonight the weight was too much, and the walls of this empty kitchen felt like they were closing in on me. I wore the same uniform I had worn for months, a simple black dress with a white apron tied neatly around my waist, as though neatness could hide the exhaustion etched into my bones. To anyone else, I was just a maid, a quiet shadow who moved through the grand halls unseen, a pair of hands that carried trays and polished floors. But behind that uniform lived a woman unraveling piece by piece, someone whose life had been carved out of sacrifices, whose dreams had been abandoned long ago, and whose heart carried more burdens than it could bear. The wealthy family I worked for never looked twice at me. To them, I was part of the furniture, expected to be there, expected to serve, expected to smile politely, even when my body screamed with fatigue. But the truth was that every plate I scrubbed, every glass I polished, every floor I shined, was done with the knowledge that my wages were never enough to keep up with the life crumbling outside these walls. My mother's medicine was more expensive each month, her body growing weaker as time dragged her down. The rent on our small apartment loomed like a predator, always waiting, always threatening to consume us if I slipped even once. My younger siblings depended on me in ways no child should have to depend on someone barely holding herself together. They looked at me for answers, for stability, for hope, and I gave them everything I could, even if it meant there was nothing left of me when the day ended. The exhaustion was constant, but what hurt most was the invisibility. I moved like a ghost through this mansion, my existence acknowledged only when someone needed something. I wasn't a person to them, I was a function. I cleaned, I served, I disappeared. And though I told myself over and over that it didn't matter, that my value was measured in the pay I sent home and the bills it covered, there were nights like this one where the truth became unbearable. Nights where I wanted someone to see me, not the uniform, not the duties, but me, the woman who cried silently over a sink of dirty dishes because she didn't know how much longer she could fight. The air was heavy that night, thick with loneliness, the kind of loneliness that settles in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, trying to muffle the sound of my sobs, terrified that someone might hear me, yet at the same time aching for someone to notice. The polished marble counters reflected my broken posture as I slumped against the sink, apron damp with tears I couldn't control. The silence was cruel, amplifying every ragged breath, every sniffle, every whispered prayer I let slip into the empty room. I feel like the loneliest person alive, I whispered to the empty kitchen, my voice so fragile it startled even me. The words hung in the air, echoing back like an admission I could no longer deny. Loneliness had become my shadow, more faithful than any friend. Always there, always watching, always reminding me that I was invisible to the world around me. Memories of my father flickered in my mind the way his illness had drained not just his body but also our savings, leaving us with nothing but debts and grief when he finally passed. I thought of my mother, her frail frame sinking deeper into the worn sofa each day, her cough rattling through the walls of our apartment like a cruel reminder of what I couldn't fix. I thought of my brothers, their wide eyes staring up at me with questions I couldn't answer, asking when life would get better, when food would be enough, when they could have what other kids had. Each time, I lied. Each time, I smiled and said tomorrow would be better, even when I knew tomorrow would look exactly the same as today. The weight of it all pressed harder against my chest, until I felt like I was suffocating. I gripped the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white, desperate to hold on to something solid as my world crumbled inside me. The sobs came harder, shaking my body, and I slid down to the tiled floor, curling my arms around my knees like a child who had lost her way. The kitchen lights glared above me, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every crack in the facade I had built, and I let myself break in a way I never allowed during the day. The loneliness was suffocating, but what made it worse was the silence. Silence that swallowed every prayer I whispered. Silence that mocked me with its emptiness. Silence that reminded me no one was coming. I buried my face against my knees, tears soaking into the fabric of my apron, and for the first time in a long time, I admitted to myself that I didn't know how much longer I could endure. The minutes dragged on, the clock ticking louder, each second a reminder that I was alone in this kitchen, alone in this life, carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. My sobs softened into hiccups, my body trembling from the release of everything I had kept hidden, and in the blur of my tears, I let myself surrender to despair. But just as I thought I was utterly alone, just as I believed the night would swallow me whole, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a change in the air so faint I wondered if my exhausted mind was imagining it. The hum of the refrigerator no longer seemed like the only sound in the room. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with something else, something I couldn't name. The tiny hairs on the back of my neck rose, and my heartbeat stuttered in my chest. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, my tears hanging mid-breath as I strained to listen. And then I felt it, a presence. Not imagined, not dreamed, but real. The kind of presence that made the air heavier, that made the shadows seem deeper, that made me realize with a sinking heart that I was no longer as invisible as I thought. And then, I realized, someone was watching me. Power collides with vulnerability when the CEO walks into the dark kitchen. I thought the worst thing that could happen to me that night was being left alone with my own thoughts, drowning in the weight of my tears. But I was wrong. The true worst thing was what happened next, the sound of footsteps. They were steady, deliberate, echoing faintly across the marble hallway that led to the kitchen. For a moment, I froze, telling myself it was just another maid, or perhaps the butler making a late-night round. But deep inside, I knew better. These steps carried weight, authority, the kind of presence that made the air shift even before the person entered the room. My chest tightened, my body stiffened, and when the tall figure finally stepped into the dim light of the kitchen, I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't a servant. It wasn't a butler. It wasn't someone who could ignore my breakdown. It was him, the CEO. I had only ever seen him from a distance, a shadow of authority in expensive suits, his voice firm and commanding in meetings I was never part of, his presence powerful enough to silence an entire room without raising it. To me, he was the untouchable figure who owned this house, this company, this empire. People whispered his name with a mixture of respect and fear, always careful around him, always aware that one look from him could make or break careers. And now here he was, standing in the doorway of the kitchen at midnight, his sharp eyes fixed on me like I was a secret he had just uncovered. My entire body went cold. I scrambled to wipe my face, dragging the back of my hand across my cheeks, but my tears had already betrayed me, leaving my skin blotchy and raw. My hands trembled as I reached for a plate, pretending to scrub it as though I hadn't just been sitting on the floor in tears. But no matter how much I tried to disguise it, there was no hiding the truth. The CEO had caught me in the middle of my weakness. Panic clawed at me, hot and suffocating. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, to erase the evidence, to put the mask of obedience back in place before it was too late. I straightened my posture, forcing my shoulders back, but my body betrayed me with shaking hands and uneven breaths. I wanted to speak, to apologize, to offer some excuse, but my throat closed like a trap, the words choking before they could form. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unyielding, and it was worse than any scolding, worse than any shout. His silence pressed against my chest, heavy as stone, until my heart felt like it would break under the weight. The only thought I could hold on to was one that filled me with dread. Will I lose everything because of this weakness? I had spent years building walls, convincing myself that strength meant never letting anyone see me break, never letting anyone hear my sobs or witness my exhaustion. To be caught like this, in the middle of my breakdown, was like being stripped of every defense I had left. If he saw me as fragile, if he saw me as unstable, would he dismiss me without a second thought? Would he decide I wasn't fit to work here, that I was just another problem to be replaced? The fear of losing my job, my income, my family's fragile survival, consumed me more than the shame of being seen. The room felt smaller with him in it, the shadows retreating from his presence, the dim kitchen lights illuminating the sharp lines of his face. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me want to shrink into the floor, yet I couldn't look away. It was as though he was peeling back layers I had spent years hiding behind, exposing not just my tears but every truth I had buried. His expression gave nothing away, no anger, no pity, no judgment, just silence. And somehow, that silence was worse than anything else. I lowered my gaze, unable to endure the weight of his stare. My hands fumbled with the dish I was holding, nearly dropping it into the sink, and I gripped it tighter, as if holding on to that fragile piece of porcelain could anchor me against the storm raging inside me. My breath came in uneven gasps, loud in the stillness, and the sound embarrassed me even more. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into the shadows of the mansion as though I had never existed, but there was no escaping the reality that he was standing there, watching me fall apart. Every instinct in me screamed that I had failed to stay invisible, failed to be strong, failed to keep my pain buried where it belonged. My chest burned with humiliation, my mind spiraling into dark places where I imagined packing my things, leaving the mansion, returning home to face the questions I couldn't answer from the family who depended on me. The future stretched before me like a cliff, and with each second of his silence, I felt closer to the edge. The kitchen, once my secret refuge, now felt like a courtroom where I stood accused, and he was the judge whose verdict would decide my fate. My ears strained for any sound from him, a sigh, a word, a command, but there was nothing. Only the heavy silence of a man who saw more than he should, and that silence became unbearable. My skin prickled, my throat tightened, and I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep myself from breaking further. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity of suffocating stillness, he moved. Just a shift of his stance, the faintest motion, but enough to send my pulse racing. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought, as though he was studying me, as though my tears were a puzzle he intended to solve. My heart thundered, my lungs ached, and I could barely stand the suspense of waiting for him to speak. I braced myself for the worst, for dismissal, for anger, for words that would tear apart the fragile thread of security I had clung to for so long. My lips trembled, my knees threatened to give way, and I held onto the counter with everything I had left. The seconds stretched painfully, each one heavier than the last, until at last, his voice broke through the silence. Then, he asked the one question that shook me to my core. Sometimes a single question can break every wall you've built around yourself. His voice came quietly, almost softer than the sound of my own uneven breathing, and yet the words cut through the silence of the kitchen like a blade through glass. "Why are you crying?" he asked. 4 simple words. 4 words I had prayed for years someone might care enough to ask, yet 4 words I never imagined would come from him, of all people. My body went still as though the world itself had frozen around me, and for a heartbeat I forgot how to breathe. I had built walls around myself for so long that they felt like part of who I was, walls made of silence, obedience, and carefully constructed smiles. Walls that kept the world from seeing the truth, that behind the uniform and the polite nods lived a woman falling apart. No one had ever cared enough to break through those walls. No one had ever asked the question he had just asked. And now, hearing it from his lips, I felt my defenses splinter. The fragile mask I had worn for years cracking in ways I wasn't prepared for. 1,000 responses rushed through my mind, each one a lie designed to protect me. I could tell him I was just tired, that the work had caught up to me, that the long hours had drained me more than usual. I could laugh it off, say the tears were nothing, that I was fine. I could bow my head and apologize for causing a scene, for disturbing his quiet night, for being anything other than invisible. Every lie screamed at me to choose it, to reach for it, to use it as a shield, because telling the truth was too dangerous. But there was another voice, quieter yet stronger, buried deep within me. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment I had longed for. A chance to be seen. A chance to let someone else hold the weight I had carried alone for so long. Yet the thought terrified me. If I revealed everything, the debts, the illness, the hunger, the loneliness, would he see me as weak? Would he strip me of the little dignity I still had? Or worse, would he dismiss me from this job that was my family's last lifeline? The risk of honesty felt unbearable, and yet the longing for release pulled at me with equal force. My throat tightened as though the words I wanted to speak were shackled inside me. My lips parted once, twice, but no sound came out. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to ground myself against the storm inside my chest. The walls I had built for years groaned under the pressure of his question, and I could feel them cracking, splintering, threatening to collapse entirely. I wanted to hold them up, to rebuild them, to keep myself safe in the prison I had always known, but my exhaustion betrayed me. I was too tired to keep fighting. His eyes never left mine. They were not cold, not sharp with judgment, but steady, patient, as though he was giving me permission to answer in my own time. That patience frightened me more than anger ever could, because it made me feel as though he truly wanted to know, as though my answer mattered. No one had ever waited for me to speak before. No one had ever cared to hear the story behind my silence. Inside my mind, voices battled for dominance. Say nothing. Protect yourself. If you tell him the truth, you'll lose everything. But another voice whispered, "This is your chance," he asked. "He wants to know. If you don't speak now, you may never have another chance to let someone see you." The war inside me left me trembling, my body swaying as though I might collapse under the weight of indecision. Tears threatened again, burning at the corners of my eyes, undoing the frantic effort I had made to wipe them away earlier. My chest rose and fell in uneven gasps, and the silence between us grew louder with every second. He waited, his presence unyielding, and I realized that silence itself had become my prison. If I stayed quiet, the walls around me would only grow higher. If I lied, I would bury myself deeper into a loneliness I could no longer survive. The longer I stood there, the clearer it became that I could not keep carrying this alone. The exhaustion was too great, the pain too heavy, the silence too cruel. I thought of my mother, fragile and fading. I thought of my brothers, their hungry eyes searching mine for hope. I thought of the endless cycle of scrubbing floors and counting pennies, of pretending to be strong while breaking inside. And in that moment, I understood that silence would not save me anymore. I took a breath, shaky and uneven, my chest tightening as though my own body fought against what I was about to do. My lips trembled as I tried to form the words, fear clawing at me with sharp, merciless fingers. Every instinct screamed to stop, to protect myself, to retreat behind the mask that had kept me safe for so long. But something stronger pushed forward the desperate, aching need to finally be heard. I lifted my eyes, meeting his gaze one more time. What I saw there gave me just enough courage to take the step I had always been too afraid to take. His eyes were not filled with scorn or annoyance. They were steady, calm, and strangely human, as though he had seen enough of life to recognize the truth behind my tears. That look stripped away the last of my defenses, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, but ready. The words trembled on my lips, fragile and raw, but they refused to stay buried any longer. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shatter. My body shook as though releasing a weight too heavy for one person to carry. And in that moment, I made the choice that would change everything. And against all my instincts, I told him everything. Years of silent suffering finally come out in one vulnerable confession. The moment the words left his lips. "Why are you crying?" I knew there was no turning back. I had spent years perfecting the art of silence, years convincing myself that the only way to survive was to bury my pain deep enough that no one could ever find it. But standing there under his gaze, my walls cracked in a way I could not repair. My chest ached with the weight of words that had been imprisoned for far too long, and before I could stop myself, they came rushing out. I don't know how much longer I can do this," I whispered, my voice trembling, so soft I wasn't sure he'd even heard me. The admission tasted bitter on my tongue, a confession I had never dared to speak aloud. Tears slipped down my cheeks, hot and unrelenting, and once they started, I couldn't stop them. My hands shook as I gripped the counter for balance, the strength I pretended to have all day finally abandoning me. At first, the words came in fragments, broken pieces of a story too heavy to tell in one breath. "My mother is sick. She hasn't been well for a long time. Every month the medical bills grow higher, and every month I wonder how we're going to pay them." My throat tightened, the image of her frail body lying on the worn sofa back home flashing in my mind. She tries to pretend she's strong, but I see it in her eyes. She's slipping, and I can't stop it. The tears blurred my vision, but I pressed on because if I stopped, I knew I'd never find the courage again. My father died years ago. His illness drained everything we had. We sold what little we owned. We borrowed from anyone willing to lend. But in the end, it wasn't enough. He left us with nothing but debts, and I've been trying to repay them ever since. My voice cracked on the word debts, the weight of it heavy even in the air. "My brothers." I paused, biting back a sob that tore at my chest. "They're still so young, too young to understand why their bellies ache at night, too young to understand why they can't have the things their classmates have. They ask me when life will get better, when we'll be like other families, when the struggle will finally end. And I look into their eyes, and I lie. I tell them tomorrow will be better. I tell them to keep hoping. But inside, I know tomorrow will be just as cruel as today." The words spilled out faster now, my voice trembling but unyielding, as though once the dam had broken, there was no stopping the flood. "I work here day and night, scrubbing floors until my hands bleed, serving food I could never afford to eat, polishing silver that's worth more than my family has ever owned. And no matter how hard I work, it's never enough. The bills keep coming, the debt collectors keep knocking, and every day I feel like I'm drowning a little more." I pressed the heel of my palm against my eyes, trying to stop the torrent of tears, but the sobs kept coming, raw and unrestrained. "And the worst part," I choked, struggling to steady, "my breath. The worst part is that I feel invisible. I move through this house like a shadow, unseen, unheard, unnoticed. No one ever asks how I'm doing. No one ever wonders if I'm okay. To them, I'm just the maid. A uniform. A pair of hands that clean up their mess. They don't see me. They don't care to see me. And after a while, you start to believe maybe you're not worth seeing." The silence around me was deafening. He hadn't moved since I began speaking, hadn't interrupted once, hadn't offered so much as a nod. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on me, his expression unreadable. That silence terrified me. I wanted him to say something, anything, to break the unbearable weight pressing down on me, but he didn't. And somehow, that silence made me speak even more. "I am so tired," I confessed, my voice trembling but firm, carrying the weight of years of exhaustion. "Tired of pretending I'm strong. Tired of carrying a family on shoulders that were never meant to bear so much. Tired of being invisible in a world where I am already broken. Every day I wear a mask for this house, and every night I come here and cry until I can't breathe. And I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it." The confession hung between us, fragile yet suffocating. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my hands trembling so violently I had to grip the edge of the counter just to stay upright. The kitchen felt too small, the air too thick, as though my words had filled every corner of the room and left no space for me to hide. I had given him everything, every piece of my pain, every scar I had hidden, every truth I had buried under years of silence. It was all laid bare before him now, vulnerable and raw, and there was no taking it back. Shame washed over me in waves, but alongside it was something else, something I hadn't felt in years: relief. For the first time, someone knew. Someone had seen me, not just the maid, not just the uniform, but me, the broken, exhausted, desperate woman beneath it all. Still, the silence stretched on. He didn't shift, didn't look away, didn't even blink. He simply stood there, watching, as though he was weighing every word I had said. His gaze was heavy, not with anger or pity, but with something I couldn't name, something that unsettled me even more than judgment would have. I wiped at my tears with the back of my hand, though it was useless. New ones replaced them just as quickly. My chest rose and fell in uneven waves, and in that silence I realized how exposed I truly was. If he wanted to, he could destroy me with a single decision. He could dismiss me, cast me out, strip away the fragile thread of survival I had fought to hold on to. My life, my family's survival, rested in the hands of the man who now knew all my secrets. The weight of that realization made my knees weak, and I lowered myself slowly to the stool by the counter, afraid I might collapse entirely if I didn't sit. I buried my face in my hands, unable to meet his gaze any longer, ashamed of the vulnerability I had just unleashed. For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was my ragged breathing, the echo of my sobs bouncing off the marble walls like a cruel reminder of everything I had confessed. And then, slowly, as though compelled by something beyond my control, I lifted my eyes to meet his. But when I finished, his eyes held something I had never seen before. Sometimes silence is more terrifying than anger. When the last words of my confession slipped into the air, the kitchen fell into a stillness so heavy it seemed to press down on my chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. I had poured out everything I had buried for years: the debts, the sickness, the hunger, the exhaustion, the loneliness that consumed me, and now there was nothing left to hide behind. I stood exposed before him, raw and trembling, my tears staining my face like evidence of my failure to remain strong. And yet, he said nothing. He didn't move. He didn't frown. He didn't soften. His expression remained unreadable, carved in stone, as though my words had evaporated before they even reached him. That silence was unbearable. If he had shouted at me, at least I would have known where I stood. If he had told me I was weak, if he had dismissed me with harsh words, I would have had something concrete to hold on to. But this silence was like standing on the edge of a cliff, blindfolded, waiting for either a hand to pull me back or the final push that would send me plummeting into nothingness. My body shook with fear as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall growing louder, crueler, with every beat. My thoughts spiraled out of control, racing faster than I could catch them. This is the end. This is it. He's already decided I'm a liability. Tomorrow he'll tell the butler to let me go. I'll pack my few belongings, leave this mansion behind, and walk home to tell my mother that I failed her. My brothers will look at me with those wide eyes, asking what we'll do now, and I'll have no answer. This is how everything ends. Not with a storm, but with silence. The guilt was unbearable. My father's voice echoed in my memory, telling me I had to be strong, that I had to carry the family after he was gone. And here I was, falling apart in front of the one man who had the power to strip me of the only thing keeping us afloat. Why couldn't you just stay quiet? Why did you have to let it all out? Why couldn't you just keep smiling like you always did? The questions attacked me like knives, each one sharper than the last, cutting into the fragile thread of dignity I still clung to. I stared at the floor, unable to meet his gaze any longer, because the weight of it felt like judgment, even if he hadn't spoken. My fingers dug into the edge of the stool I was perched on, my knuckles turning white, as though holding on tightly enough could stop my world from collapsing. The silence grew louder with every second, a suffocating presence that filled the room until it seemed there was no air left to breathe. My chest tightened with panic, my heart racing so fast it made me dizzy. I wanted to scream just to fill the emptiness, to beg him to say something, anything that would give me clarity. But my voice failed me. My throat burned, raw from crying, and every attempt to speak died before it reached my lips. All I could do was sit there, trembling, waiting for the verdict I was certain was coming. The truth was, silence was worse than anger. Anger I could survive. Dismissal I could endure. But silence left me powerless, trapped in uncertainty, left to create my own punishment in the prison of my thoughts. And in my mind, the punishment was always the same: losing everything I had fought so desperately to protect. I closed my eyes for a moment, tears spilling freely down my cheeks, whispering words I barely realized I had spoken aloud. "Please, God, don't let this be the end. Please, don't take this from me." My voice cracked, and the sound startled me, breaking through the stillness like a fragile thread snapping under strain. Yet even then, he remained silent. Every instinct inside me screamed to run, to leave the room before he could speak, before his silence turned into the words I feared most. But I couldn't. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground, as though the marble beneath me refused to let me escape. So I sat there, every muscle tense, waiting for the inevitable. I thought of all the years I had endured, the endless nights of work, the sacrifices I had made, the dignity I had swallowed again and again just to keep going. Was it all going to end because I had let myself cry in the wrong place, at the wrong time? Because I had let the wrong person see behind the mask? The injustice of it burned inside me, but even stronger than the anger was the shame. Shame that I had failed. Shame that I had been weak. Shame that I had dared to hope someone might actually care. His silence stretched so long I began to wonder if he was waiting for me to say more, to continue humiliating myself until I had nothing left. The thought made me sick, but still I couldn't stop the words that tumbled through my mind like a relentless storm. "You're worthless. You're weak. You're nothing more than a maid who forgot her place. He sees it now, and tomorrow the whole house will know too." My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I had never felt so small, so fragile, so utterly at the mercy of someone else's decision. I forced myself to glance up at him, just once, desperate for some clue as to what he was thinking. His eyes met mine instantly, and the depth I saw there terrified me more than his silence. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't name, and that uncertainty sent another shiver of panic racing down my spine. The clock ticked louder. My heart pounded harder. My body trembled with the weight of fear and despair, and I thought I would collapse if the silence lasted even 1 second longer. I gripped the counter beside me with both hands, holding on as though it could keep me from falling apart, and I prayed, truly prayed, that when he finally spoke, his words wouldn't destroy me completely. And then, just as my mind reached the brink of breaking, just as I thought I would suffocate under the crushing weight of not knowing, he finally moved. His shoulders shifted slightly, his gaze never leaving mine, and when he opened his mouth, his voice carried across the silence like a spark in the dark. And then he finally spoke, with words that changed my life forever. The ruthless man everyone feared, revealed a side no one believed existed. The silence that had stretched endlessly finally broke, and in that moment I braced myself for the sharpness of anger, for the cruelty of dismissal, for the cold words I was certain would cut me down where I stood. I had prepared myself for judgment, for condemnation, for the end of everything I had been clinging to, but when his voice finally filled the air, it was nothing like what I expected. It was steady, low, but softened in a way I had never heard before. "You've been carrying too much," he said. "No one should have to hold all of that alone." The words hit me harder than any reprimand ever could. For a second, I thought I had imagined them, that my desperate mind had twisted his tone into something kinder than it really was. But when I looked up, when I forced myself to meet his eyes, there was no mistaking it. His expression had changed, not cold, Not hard, but steady, human, and strangely compassionate. It was as if the man who was feared in boardrooms, the man whose reputation was built on ruthlessness, had stepped aside, and in his place stood someone else entirely. I couldn't comprehend it. For so long, he had been a figure of power and distance to me, a man whose presence could silence an entire room without effort. People whispered about him with a mixture of respect and fear, painting him as someone unshakable, someone untouchable, someone who would never stoop to notice the pain of someone like me. Yet here he was, not only noticing but acknowledging it, speaking to me in a voice that carried no judgment, only understanding. A lump rose in my throat, my chest tightening as I tried to process the impossible. My voice broke, and I shook my head, unable to find words. I didn't think anyone would ever. I stopped, biting my lip hard to keep the tears from spilling again, but it was useless. They came anyway, unstoppable, because for the first time in so long, I felt something I had nearly forgotten existed. Seen. His gaze didn't waver. It wasn't the gaze of a man analyzing or judging. It was the gaze of someone who had actually listened. The weight of that realization shook me more than his silence had, because I had spent years believing my story didn't matter, that my tears were wasted on empty air, that no one would ever care to know what it cost me to survive. Yet now, in this kitchen, at this strange midnight hour, the man everyone believed incapable of softness had looked at me and said words that made my pain feel real. "You are stronger than you think," he added quietly, his voice carrying a conviction I didn't understand. "Most people wouldn't have lasted a fraction of what you've endured. But you're still standing." The compliment startled me as much as his compassion. Strong? I had never thought of myself as strong. To me, strength was not crying, not breaking, not crumbling under the weight of responsibility. But here I was, sobbing in front of him, trembling like a child, spilling confessions I had sworn I'd never share. How could that possibly be strength? And yet, hearing him say it, hearing him acknowledge my survival as something powerful, stirred something inside me, a flicker of hope I hadn't allowed myself in years. I gripped the edge of the counter tighter, desperate to steady myself. "You don't understand," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not strong. I'm falling apart. I can't do this anymore." The words tumbled out, heavy with defeat, but instead of recoiling, instead of dismissing me, he leaned slightly closer, his expression unchanging but his eyes holding a depth I couldn't ignore. "I do understand," he said simply. "More than you think." The certainty in his tone unsettled me, raising questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. How could a man like him, a man who lived in wealth and luxury, a man who had built an empire on power, possibly understand what it meant to live in shadows, to struggle for every coin, to cry alone in kitchens where no one cared? And yet, the way he said it, the quiet strength in his voice, made me believe he wasn't lying. I lowered my gaze, shaking my head again, tears dripping onto my apron. "I've been invisible for so long," I admitted, my voice cracking. "No one ever cared to ask. No one ever cared to see me. I didn't think it mattered anymore." "It does matter," he said, his words cutting through the heaviness like light through darkness. "And you're not invisible. Not anymore." The simplicity of his statement undid me. For years, I had trained myself to accept invisibility as my fate, to believe I was nothing more than the background to other people's lives. And yet, here was the man I feared most, the man I believed least capable of compassion, telling me the one thing I had longed to hear but never dared to hope for: that I mattered, that I wasn't invisible. I felt my knees weaken, my body trembling with the weight of emotions I couldn't contain. Relief, disbelief, confusion, and something dangerously close to gratitude flooded through me, tangling together until I couldn't separate them anymore. I wanted to thank him, to fall to my knees in exhaustion, and thank him for seeing me, for saying words that breathed air, back into lungs that had long forgotten what it felt like to truly breathe. But my lips refused to form the words, too afraid to break the fragile magic of the moment. For the first time in years, the kitchen didn't feel like a prison. It didn't feel like a cage echoing with my loneliness. It felt like something else, like a place where, against all odds, I had been seen. He held my gaze a moment longer, his silence no longer terrifying but strangely grounding. And then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. His words carried no anger, no cruelty, but something far more dangerous. Possibility. But then, he made me an offer that could change everything. When pride clashes with desperation, the heart breaks in two. I thought his compassion was the only surprise the night could hold. I thought the words he had already spoken, the acknowledgement, the understanding, the reassurance that I was not invisible, were more than I would ever receive. But I was wrong. Because what he said next struck me harder than anything that had come before. His voice was steady, measured, and without hesitation as he spoke. I want to help you. I can pay off the debts. I can make sure your mother gets the care she needs. I can see to it that your brothers get an education, that they never have to live this way again. The words hit me like thunder. Impossible to process, impossible to believe. My breath caught in my throat, my heart skipping painfully, as though it had forgotten how to beat. For a moment, I simply stared at him, certain I had misheard, certain my exhausted mind was twisting reality into something kinder than it could possibly be. But there was no mistaking the seriousness in his eyes. He meant it. He was offering me a way out of everything that had been drowning me for years. My knees weakened beneath me, and I gripped the counter with trembling hands, desperate to steady myself against the wave of emotions crashing through me. Relief, disbelief, fear, hope, they all collided at once, leaving me breathless and overwhelmed. He was offering me the miracle I had prayed for night after night, the miracle I had stopped believing could ever come. And yet, instead of gratitude, the first feeling that rose inside me was resistance. My father's words echoed in my mind, words he had spoken when I was still a child, clinging to his hand during our darkest days. Dignity is the one thing no one can take from you. Guard it, even if the world strips you of everything else. Pride had been my armor for so long, the one thing I could cling to when poverty, hunger, and exhaustion threatened to destroy me. To accept help, especially from him, felt like surrendering that last piece of myself. My lips trembled as I shook my head, my voice breaking. Why would you do this? I'm just a maid to you. I'm nothing. You don't owe me anything. He didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, as he answered simply, because you shouldn't have to fight this battle alone. Because I can do something, and it would be cruel not to. His certainty unsettled me. His confidence in making such an offer made me feel even smaller, even more powerless. He had the ability to change my life with a single decision, while I stood there trembling, torn apart by the weight of my choice. To accept meant survival, security, a future for my family. To refuse meant keeping my pride, my dignity, but condemning my loved ones to continued suffering. Inside me, pride clashed with desperation, in a war so fierce I thought it might rip me in two. I imagined my mother's fragile body, her tired eyes, her quiet coughs that shook her frame each night. I imagined my brothers, hungry but still smiling, waiting for me to tell them life would get better. I imagined the debts piling higher, the collectors knocking louder, the days of work stretching endlessly with no hope of relief. And then I imagined the alternative, accepting his offer, handing over my burdens to him, and in return receiving a chance at a life I had never dared to dream of. But at what cost? Should I accept or refuse? The question screamed through my mind with every frantic heartbeat. If I accepted, would I lose myself? Would I become indebted to him in ways I couldn't repay? Would my dignity vanish the moment I relied on someone else to carry the weight I had sworn was mine to bear? And if I refused, would I watch my family sink deeper into misery while I clung stubbornly to pride that could not feed or heal them? The turmoil was unbearable. I pressed a hand against my chest, trying to steady the rapid thundering of my heart, but it was useless. The conflict inside me tore at my soul until I thought I might collapse under its weight. I lifted my eyes to him again, searching his face desperately for answers, for any sign of why he would do this, why he would care about someone like me. But his expression remained calm, unreadable, his eyes steady as if he already knew the war raging inside me. The thought struck me then, was there more to this than simple compassion? Was there something else driving his offer? Something I couldn't see yet? Doubt seeped into me like poison, twisting the fragile hope his words had ignited. Did he pity me? Did he see me as some charity case? Someone to rescue just to soothe his own conscience? Or worse, did he see me as indebted, someone who would owe him forever in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine? I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the warm light of the kitchen. My voice trembled as I whispered, "I don't understand why. Why me? Why now? What are you expecting from me if I say yes?" His expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something deeper, something almost haunted. He stepped closer, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "There's something you don't know," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with unspoken weight. "Something about me. Something about why I understand you more than you think." My breath caught in my throat, my confusion deepening. His words carried a gravity I couldn't ignore, a truth hovering just out of reach, waiting to be revealed. And then, he revealed a secret that explained everything. Even the strongest men carry scars that no one can see. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, as his words lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. "There's something you don't know." His gaze held mine with a weight that made it impossible to look away, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something break through the carefully constructed mask he always wore. It wasn't authority. It wasn't power. It was something raw, something almost fragile, something I never would have imagined lived inside him. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier, but threaded with a heaviness that told me every word cost him something to say. "You think I don't understand," he began, "but I do, more than you could ever imagine. Because once, I was where you are. I know what it feels like to be invisible. I know what it feels like to wonder how you'll survive another day." The words stunned me into silence. Him? The CEO? The man who owned more than I could fathom? The man whose very name carried weight like thunder in the city he was telling me he had once been like me? The thought was impossible, almost laughable, and yet the look in his eyes told me it was not a story crafted out of pity. It was the truth. He stepped away from the counter, his eyes no longer fixed on me but on some memory far beyond the kitchen walls. I wasn't born into wealth. People assume I was because they can't imagine otherwise, but the truth is, I grew up with nothing. My father left before I was old enough to remember his face. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads, but even then, there were nights we went to bed hungry. He paused, his jaw tightening, his hands curling slightly at his sides as though gripping invisible memories. I listened, my heart pounding, barely able to process the shift unfolding before me. He continued, his voice unwavering, though each word carried the weight of years he had buried deep. "I know what it's like to stare at overdue bills, to hear the knock of people demanding money we didn't have, to see the shame in my mother's eyes because she couldn't give us more. I know what it's like to walk into school with holes in my shoes, to hear the whispers of kids who thought they were better because they had what I didn't. And I know what it's like to be betrayed by the very people you thought would stand by you." My throat tightened as I watched him, realizing that the man who was feared by so many was standing in front of me, stripped of his armor, his scars laid bare. He didn't just know hardship, he had lived it, breathed it, survived it. "By the time I was a teenager," he went on, his tone sharper now, his memories pouring out like truths he had kept hidden for too long. "I was working every job I could find. I cleaned, I carried, I delivered, I begged people to give me a chance. And when I finally thought I was making progress, the people I trusted most, family, friends, turned on me. They took what little I had, used my desperation, and left me with nothing. Nothing but anger, nothing but hunger, nothing but the determination to never be that powerless again." His words sliced through me, echoing my own life in ways I hadn't expected. Poverty, hunger, Betrayal, the shadows that had haunted me, were the same ones that had once haunted him. I had always imagined him as untouchable, a man who had never known struggle, but now I saw the truth. His empire, his power, his ruthless reputation had been built not on privilege, but on scars. My tears welled again, but this time they were not born of loneliness or despair. They were born of recognition. For the first time since this night began, I didn't feel like the gulf between us was endless. I didn't feel like he lived in a world I could never understand. Instead, I felt the walls that separated us crumble, replaced by something far more powerful than distance understanding. He turned back to me then, his eyes locking onto mine once more. There was no pity in his gaze, no condescension, only a deep, unshakable truth. "That's why I know what you're carrying," he said firmly. "Because I carried it too. I know the exhaustion. I know the loneliness. I know the fire that keeps you moving even when you think you can't anymore. I know it, because it was once my life." The kitchen was silent, except for the sound of my own uneven breathing. I could hardly find words, my chest aching as I tried to absorb the reality of what he had revealed. The ruthless CEO, the man whose presence could strike fear into anyone, had lived a life so painfully close to mine. He had once been hungry. He had once been invisible. He had once been desperate, and that knowledge shifted something inside me forever. I had thought compassion was the most shocking thing I could see from him, but this revelation of his hidden past was something else entirely. It was a bridge between us I never thought could exist. It made me realize that he wasn't standing on some mountain looking down at me from above. He had climbed from the same valley I was still trapped in, and if he had survived it, if he had built something out of the ashes of his suffering, maybe, just maybe, there was hope for me too. Respect bloomed in me where only fear had lived before. For the first time, I didn't see him as a master and myself as a servant. For the first time, I saw him as human. I swallowed hard, my voice fragile as I whispered, You really do understand." His eyes softened, just for a moment, enough to confirm what I already knew. "More than you think," he said. The truth of his words settled deep into me, a truth that would linger long after this night was over. His scars had shaped him, just as mine were shaping me. His survival was proof that pain could be transformed, that weakness could become strength, that invisibility could one day give way to being seen. And as I sat there, still trembling from my own confession, still reeling from his, I realized that something new had taken root between us, something fragile but undeniable. His words stayed in my heart, but this was only the beginning. Respect grows in places where only distance once lived. In the days that followed, something inside the house shifted in ways I never could have imagined. It wasn't loud or obvious, not the kind of change others might notice at first glance. It lived in small details, quiet gestures, subtle moments that spoke louder than grand declarations ever could. For so long, I had walked through the halls of that mansion as if I were a shadow, invisible and unnoticed, my presence tolerated but never truly acknowledged. But after that night in the kitchen, after his revelation and his compassion, I felt the weight of his gaze in a new way, not as judgment, but as recognition. He began to see me differently, and in turn, I began to see myself differently. At first, it was as small as a pause in the hallway. He would stop and ask if I had eaten, and though the question seemed simple, to me it was extraordinary. No one had ever cared enough to ask before. Another time, I caught him instructing one of the senior staff to ease my workload, insisting I not be given the endless back-breaking tasks that had once consumed every moment of my day. And when he noticed the raw redness on my hands from hours of scrubbing, he had gloves delivered for me the very next morning without a word of explanation. These weren't the actions of a man keeping his distance. These were the actions of someone deliberately breaking down the walls that had once separated us, someone determined to make me feel like more than a servant. Every gesture chipped away at the years of invisibility I had endured. Every kindness whispered the same truth. I see you. At first, I didn't trust it. I told myself it was temporary, a fleeting moment of pity that would vanish as quickly as it appeared. But as the days stretched into weeks, the kindness didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. He didn't treat me like a fragile thing to be pitied, nor did he treat me like property to be controlled. He treated me as a person, something I had almost forgotten I was. For the first time in years, I began to carry myself differently. The weight on my shoulders didn't disappear, but it felt lighter somehow, easier to bear. I started to move through the house with more confidence, not because my circumstances had changed, but because the way he treated me had altered the way I saw myself. For so long, I had believed I was destined to remain unseen, my identity swallowed by the uniform I wore. But under his gaze, under his gestures of respect, I began to remember that I was more than the work I did, more than the burdens I carried, more than the tears I shed in secret. There was a moment that stayed with me more than all the others. I had been setting the table in the dining room, carefully arranging silverware on the long, polished surface, when he walked in unexpectedly. I froze, my instinct to lower my head, to retreat into the background as I always did. But instead of ignoring me, instead of brushing past me as though I didn't exist, he stopped. He looked at me, not at the uniform, not at the task I was performing, but at me. And then, with a calm sincerity that shook me to my core, he said, "Thank you. You do more here than anyone realizes." 2 words, thank you. Words I had never heard before in this house, words I hadn't expected to hear from him of all people. To anyone else, they might have seemed insignificant, but to me they were lightning splitting the sky, a crack of light in a world I had believed would always be dark. Gratitude was a language I hadn't been spoken to in years, and hearing it from him planted something fragile and dangerous inside me. Hope. I tried to resist it, tried to remind myself that hope was dangerous, that it could betray me just as easily as it could sustain me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the changes inside me. I no longer walked through the mansion as if I were invisible. I lifted my head a little higher. I allowed myself to breathe a little deeper. And though I didn't dare put it into words, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: dignity. It was strange, almost frightening, to be treated this way by someone whose reputation had always been built on ruthlessness. I had feared him, just like everyone else did, had believed he was incapable of kindness, incapable of compassion. Yet here he was, showing me both in ways so quiet and deliberate that they left me shaken. I didn't know why he was doing it, didn't know what had changed inside him, but I knew that his actions were changing me. I began to see him differently too. The fear I once felt when he entered a room didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became respect. And not the kind of respect born from power or authority, but the kind of respect that grows when someone shows you a side of themselves no one else believes exists. He had shared his scars with me, his hidden past, his battles with hunger and betrayal, and in doing so, he had stripped away the armor I thought separated us forever. Now, when I looked at him, I didn't see only the man at the top of the world. I saw the boy he had once been, the boy who had once felt the same hunger I had, the boy who had clawed his way out of the darkness. The bond between us was fragile, unspoken, but it was real. I felt it in the way he paused just a second longer when he passed me in the hallway. I felt it in the questions he asked about my family, not out of obligation, but out of genuine concern. I felt it in the silence we sometimes shared, a silence that no longer suffocated but comforted. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel completely alone. The thought terrified me as much as it comforted me, because I knew how easily bonds could be broken, how quickly trust could turn into betrayal, how fragile hope truly was. Still, I let myself lean into it, let myself breathe in the rare air of being respected, of being valued. For the first time, I began to believe that maybe my life didn't have to be a cycle of endless suffering. Maybe there could be something more. But life has a cruel way of reminding you that hope can be snatched away in an instant. Just when I thought things were finally changing, just when I began to carry myself with the faintest glimmer of confidence, Fate stepped in to remind me that happiness never lingers long in a life like mine. I thought things were finally getting better, until one day, everything shattered. Just when life seemed brighter, betrayal struck like lightning. For the first time in years, I had begun to believe that perhaps my life was shifting, that maybe the endless cycle of exhaustion and invisibility was breaking. His compassion, his quiet gestures of care, his words that carried both weight and comfort, they had lit a fragile flame inside me. One I guarded carefully but couldn't help but nurture. I moved through the mansion with a new kind of energy, carrying myself with dignity I had never felt before. But I should have known better. Happiness, in my life, was never allowed to last long. It began in whispers. At first, I ignored them. I had grown used to being overlooked, dismissed, or criticized, and I told myself that this was no different. But the tone of the whispers was not the same as before. It was sharper, more poisonous, laced with envy that cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I would enter a room, and conversations would fall abruptly silent, eyes darting toward me with a mixture of suspicion and malice. I told myself it was my imagination, but in my heart, I knew the truth. The other staff had noticed. They had seen the way he paused to speak to me, the way his eyes lingered a fraction longer than they did with anyone else, the way he had shielded me from tasks that left my hands bleeding. Where I had seen kindness, they saw favoritism. Where I had felt human for the first time, they saw scandal. The gossip spread like wildfire, each retelling twisting the story further from the truth. What had been compassion became whispers of something forbidden. What had been respect was twisted into suggestion, insinuations that stained me in ways I could not fight against. The venom dripped into every corner of the house, poisoning even the few neutral glances I had once received. I could feel their eyes on me constantly, burning into my back as I walked down hallways, judging me when I entered the kitchen, mocking me with snide smirks when they thought I wasn't looking. Their jealousy turned my fragile dignity into a weapon against me. In their eyes, I wasn't someone who had earned a moment of compassion. I was someone who had crossed a line, someone who had taken something that was never mine to take. The weight of their judgment crushed me more with every passing day. I tried to keep my head down, tried to bury myself in work, but the harder I tried, the more their voices grew. And no matter how hard I fought to ignore them, one truth gnawed at me with every whisper. Eventually, the rumors would reach him. That day came sooner than I expected. I had been delivering a tray of documents to his study, my hands trembling under the weight of both the papers and my own unease, when I felt the tension in the air shift. The butler avoided my gaze as he held the door open, the maids whispered to one another as I passed, and my heart sank with the certainty that something had already changed. When I entered the study, he was seated at his desk, his expression calm but unreadable, his eyes sharp in a way that made my stomach twist. He gestured for me to set the tray down, and though his movements were controlled, there was something different about the silence that followed. Finally, he spoke. His tone was level, steady, but heavy enough to crush the air from my lungs. "I've heard things." My blood ran cold. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the tray, and I lowered it quickly onto the desk, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to speak, wanted to defend myself immediately, but the words tangled in my mouth, choking me before they could escape. He continued, his eyes fixed on me with that same piercing intensity. Whispers, accusations, rumors. He didn't elaborate, but he didn't need to. I already knew. The walls of this mansion had carried venom straight to his ears, and now I was standing in the aftermath of a storm I hadn't created but could not escape. My chest ached as my heart pounded violently against my ribs. Fear clawed at me, dragging me back to that first night in the kitchen when I thought his silence would crush me. Except this time, it wasn't silence. I feared it was betrayal. Would he believe them? Would he let the words of jealous tongues outweigh the truth he had seen in me? I could feel my world teetering, ready to collapse at the slightest push. My mother's fragile health, my brother's hunger, the fragile bond we had begun to build, everything balanced on the razor's edge of his belief. If he doubted me, even for a second, it would all come crashing down. I forced my lips to move, my voice trembling as I whispered, "It isn't true. Whatever they've said, it isn't true. I swear to you, I would never." My words cracked, and I shook my head desperately, unable to finish the sentence. His eyes softened only slightly, but his silence was worse than any accusation. He didn't interrupt me, didn't question me, but neither did he reassure me. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, his silence suffocating. The study felt smaller with every passing second, the air heavier, my own fear louder. My mind filled with every possible outcome, each one darker than the last. If he believed them, I would lose my job, my dignity, and the fragile sense of hope that had just begun to grow inside me. If he doubted me, even for a moment, I would be cast back into the shadows. My life once again nothing more than survival, without meaning. And then I realized the truth. My entire world, my entire future, rested in his hands. Not because of the gossip itself, but because of the decision he would make in the face of it. I stood trembling before him, tears burning in my eyes, my voice barely more than a whisper as I breathed the only words I could manage. "Please, believe me." The silence stretched once more, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and unasked questions. And in that moment, I knew everything depended not on what I had said, not on the lies they had told, but on the choice he was about to make. And in that moment, everything depended on his decision. Trust is fragile. One doubt can destroy it all. The moment the rumors reached him, the air in the mansion changed. It was no longer filled with quiet whispers I could try to ignore. It was thick with suspicion, with silence that felt heavier than words, with a tension that wrapped itself around me like chains. I felt it in every hallway I walked, in every glance cast in my direction, in the way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The gossip had poisoned everything. And now, it had reached the one man whose belief could make or break my life. He didn't dismiss me that day in his study. He didn't accuse me, outright, nor did he defend me. Instead, he did something far worse. He remained silent, his expression unreadable, before dismissing me with a simple nod. That silence followed me like a shadow, gnawing at my insides, because I knew what it meant. He was weighing the truth. He was considering everything he had seen, everything he had heard, everything he thought he knew about me, and I was powerless to control it. The next morning, it began. He called the staff one by one, his voice steady, his questions precise, his presence commanding. The mansion became a kind of courtroom, its gilded walls transformed into a witness stand, its long halls echoing with the sound of testimony whispered in fear or sharpened by jealousy. I wasn't in the room for most of it, but I didn't need to be. I felt the weight of every word being spoken about me, words I couldn't hear but knew would shape the outcome of my life. I stayed in the kitchen, my hands trembling as I tried to keep busy with chores I could barely focus on. Every clang of a dish, every drip of water from the faucet felt magnified against the silence pressing down around me. My prayers became constant, whispered under my breath with every movement, words I repeated until they blurred together. "Please believe me. Please see me. Please don't let this destroy me." The minutes stretched into hours, every tick of the clock a reminder that my fate was being decided in rooms I couldn't enter, by voices I couldn't defend myself against. The fear was suffocating. I imagined them twisting my story further, painting me as someone I wasn't, their envy driving them to destroy the fragile respect I had fought so hard to hold on to. I thought of the looks they had given me, the smirks that had followed me through the halls, and I knew that some of them would seize this chance to strike at me. At times, I nearly broke. I nearly rushed into the study, nearly fell at his feet and begged him to believe me, to trust the truth he had already seen in me. But something inside me, whether pride or fear of making it worse, kept me silent. All I could do was wait, and that waiting felt like the cruelest punishment of all. The tension built until it felt unbearable, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. I caught glimpses of staff leaving his study, some pale and shaken, others smirking with quiet satisfaction. Each glance cut into me like a blade, making me question what poison had already been poured into his ears. The uncertainty gnawed at me until I felt hollow, until even my prayers began to feel like whispers lost in the void. It was not just my job at stake. It was my entire life. My family's survival, my mother's health, my brother's future, all of it rested on whether he chose to believe the truth of my character or the lies of those who envied me. It was more than I could bear, and yet I had no choice but to bear it. When he finally summoned me, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. The long walk to his study felt like the slow march of someone walking to judgment, every step echoing like a drumbeat of fear. My palms were slick with sweat, my breath shallow, my body trembling as though I were standing trial in the highest court. He was seated at his desk when I entered, his posture straight, his expression composed, his eyes sharp as ever. Papers were scattered across the desk, but I knew none of them mattered. The only thing that mattered was the decision he was about to speak. "Sit," he said simply, his voice carrying no warmth, no cruelty, only authority. I obeyed, my body stiff, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick with meaning I couldn't decipher. My mind screamed with questions. Does he believe me? Has he already judged me? Am I about to lose everything? When he finally spoke, his words weren't an accusation but a verdict waiting to be delivered. "I've heard many things," he said, his voice measured, controlled. "Some defend you, some accuse you. Some are lies, and some are truths twisted out of shape. But what matters is what I choose to believe." My breath caught, my chest tightening with the weight of the moment. My entire body trembled, as though his words alone had the power to shatter me. I wanted to speak, to beg, to cry, but my voice refused to come. All I could do was sit there, my eyes fixed on him, silently pleading for him to see the truth in me, silently praying that everything we had shared in that kitchen, everything he had revealed of himself, would mean enough to him to outweigh the venom of rumors. The silence stretched once more, and in that silence, I felt my entire world teetering on the edge. It was not just a job I might lose, it was the dignity he had given me, the fragile hope he had breathed into me, the bond we had begun to build. If he turned away from me now, it would destroy not only my future, but also the part of me that had finally begun to believe I was worthy of more. And then, at last, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering, his decision heavy in the air between us. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might break through my chest, my body frozen in anticipation, my soul braced for the blow I feared most. And then, with one decision, he changed my entire world. Sometimes tears don't mark an ending. They mark a beginning. I sat before him, my hands trembling in my lap, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat, waiting for words that could either destroy or redeem me. The silence felt endless, heavy enough to crush me where I sat. My heart raced with a terror I could hardly endure, and when he finally spoke, it was not just a decision, it was the turning point of my entire life. "I trust her." 3 words. That was all it took to unravel the chains of fear that had bound me, to silence the venom of gossip that had nearly destroyed me, to restore the fragile dignity I thought I had already lost forever. His voice was steady, clear, and unyielding as it echoed through the room, carrying with it the authority of a man who could silence entire worlds with a single sentence. The staff who had filled the mansion with their whispers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting away from mine. In that moment, their envy, their malice, their carefully constructed lies crumbled into dust. His support had stripped them of their power, and the silence that followed was no longer suffocating, it was liberating. I felt tears burn in my eyes again, but this time they weren't born of fear or despair. They were born of relief so sharp it was almost painful, of gratitude that swelled so strongly it left me trembling. My body sagged with the weight of it, as if I had been holding my breath for weeks and could finally exhale. I had not been cast aside. I had not been erased. I had been believed. From that moment, everything changed. He did not defend me in whispers or behind closed doors. He defended me openly, firmly, in front of those who had tried to tear me down. His decision wasn't just for me. It was a message to everyone who had ever looked at me as though I were invisible, as though I were less than human. He made it clear that I was not to be dismissed, not to be mocked, not to be broken by envy. And in doing so, he gave me back something I hadn't realized I had lost completely: my dignity. The changes rippled quickly through my life. At home, the money I sent no longer stretched painfully thin, barely covering necessities. With his help, my mother received the medical care she had needed for so long, and slowly, I began to see her health improve. The frailty that had weighed her down began to lift, replaced with a quiet strength I hadn't seen in years. My brothers, too, felt the difference. For the first time, they had books in their hands, school uniforms to wear, and meals that didn't leave them hungry at night. Their laughter grew louder, their eyes brighter, their dreams closer to reality. And for me, the transformation was more than material. It was in the way I walked through the mansion, no longer with my head bowed low, no longer with the desperate hope of going unnoticed. I moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had been seen, acknowledged, respected. My uniform no longer felt like chains binding me to invisibility. It felt like fabric I wore until the day I would step into something greater. He did not treat me like a fragile charity case. He did not pity me. Instead, he treated me as someone whose strength he respected, whose resilience he admired. That was the greatest gift of all, not the money, not the opportunities, not even the security, but the dignity of being seen as more than my suffering. And yet, with all of this, with the relief and hope blooming in my heart, I never forgot where it began. It began in the silence of the kitchen, in the raw sobs I had tried to muffle, in the brokenness I had hidden for years. It began in the moment I thought I had been caught in my weakest hour, only to discover that it was the hour that changed everything. Life did not suddenly become perfect. I knew there would still be challenges, still storms to weather, still moments where doubt and fear crept back in. But I also knew something I had never known before. I would not face them alone. I carried his words with me, his belief in me, his willingness to see me not as invisible but as human, and that knowledge became a strength I had never possessed before. Sometimes, I would find myself standing in the kitchen late at night, staring at the counters that had once mocked me with their perfection, the same tiled floor that had once soaked up my tears. But now, instead of despair, I felt something else: gratitude. Because it was there, in that room I had once hated, that everything began to change. It was there that the walls I had built around myself finally cracked. It was there that I realized even the most ruthless men could carry compassion in their hearts. It was there that my tears, which I had once believed were proof of weakness, became the very thing that opened a door I hadn't known existed. And as I looked back on those nights of loneliness and exhaustion, I understood something I had never allowed myself to believe. Sometimes, tears don't mark an ending. Sometimes, they mark the beginning of something greater. The mansion was quiet the night I finally allowed myself to breathe fully again, the night I stood in the same spot where it had all started and felt the weight of gratitude settle deeply in my chest. I had not been erased. I had not been forgotten. I had not been destroyed by envy or lies. I had been seen, and I had been given a chance to begin again. And that night, the tears I shed in the kitchen became the first step into my new life. If this story touched your heart, imagine how many more untold stories are waiting to be heard. Don't let them fade into silence. Stay with us as we bring more powerful journeys of struggle, hope, and transformation to life. Subscribe now. Share this with someone who needs it, and be part of a community that believes no one is truly invisible.